Hey everyone, welcome back to Story Time. It's Josh. Today we're going to be reading Mr. Messy by Roger Hargreaves. Super exciting, fun-looking story. I hope you're ready and I hope you're comfortable. I've got my friends here with me, some of my mates from Paw Patrol and Blazing the Monster Machines, and we're going to read Mr. Messy. Alright, let's delve into story time. Yes. Alright. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name, messy by nature. Look at all the fingerprints on that page. Clearly Mr. Messy has been all over it. I thought for a second it might have been me, and I was like, I haven't read this book yet. But Mr. Messy's been there. So let's find out what else is going on. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy looking house. The paint was peeling. The windows were broken. The tiles were missing from the roof. The flower beds were overgrown with weeds. The garden gate was off its hinges. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? He had not! Look at that! The house is all crazy looking, a bit broken up. The grass is all long, the gate's broken. Come on, Mr. Messy. Do you think you should clean up a little? Yeah, definitely. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed, yawned, scratched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and then set out for a walk, tripping over a brush he'd left lying on the garden 2 weeks before. Poor guy fell over, but it's because he left the broom out 2 weeks ago. Come on, mate. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's messy house, with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. Right at home, just in a messy, messy, messy environment. It was a particularly large wood. With lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked right through the wood until he came to the other side. And you know what he found on the other side of the wood? It's him walking through there all happy. What do you think he found on the other side? So there's some good guesses. Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage that he had ever seen. It had a lovely little garden with a stream running through the middle of it. Oh wow, look at that. Looks a lot nicer than Mr. Messy's house. There was a man in the garden, clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning. I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking him up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man appearing out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. So that's one of them there. That's either neat or tidy. One of the two. Perfect to meet Mr. Messy. They might help Mr. Messy out to be a little bit neat or tidy, eh? "We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy, "and the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," said Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. See, look, there's neat and tidy, all suited up, looking neat and tidy, but Messy doesn't want to have anything to do with it. Come on, man. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. Off we go, said Mr. Tidy. But, said Mr. Messy. But nothing, said Mr. Neat, and bundling him into their van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Messy's house at the other side of the wood. Neat and Tidy, gonna help Mr. Messy out. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. Good gracious, added Mr. Tidy. This is the messiest house I have ever seen in all my born days, they both said together at the same time. Better do something about it, said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Messy's house. They found the broken windows, it's clearly smashed, and they're like, their faces are like, what are we going to do here? We better clean this house. It's like the ultimate job for Neat and Tidy, to clean up Mr. Messy's messes. Mr. Neat hoed, and mowed, and pruned, and snipped, and clipped, and cleared, and dug, and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Big smile on his dial there, doing the garden. Thanks, buddy. Mr. Messy needs it. Mr. Tidy cleaned, and primed, and rubbed, and painted, and mended, and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. There you go. Mr. Tidy can carry the ladder okay without smashing things. If you read Mr. Bump, he bumps into everything with his ladder and breaks stuff. Then they both went inside the house. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. Good gracious, said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. Happy with the paintbrush there. Cleaning it all up. There we are, said Mr. Tidy. All finished, said Mr. Neat. Tidy and neat, said Mr. Tidy. Neat and tidy, said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. There's Neat and Tidy happy there. Job well done, job accomplished. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. Precisely, replied Mr. Tidy. What we're both thinking, they said together to Mr. Messy, is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this. But, said Mr. Messy, he doesn't look too happy. He's like, but what? Why? But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the whole house, but now of course it was neat as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got a hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Gotta always keep clean. Showers, baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. Look, you can already see him on the page. He's like a blob now. Not scribbles, like on the front page. Wow. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. You know what I'm going to have to do now? He said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. What are you going to have to do? They asked Mr. Messy. I'm going to have to change my name, said Mr. Messy. And then he chuckled, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled, and then Mr. Messy laughed, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed, and they all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that really is the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might have a visit from two people, Mr. Tidy and Mr. Neat. You know what they're called, don't you? I just said it. Mr. Tidy and Mr. Neat. Or otherwise known sometimes as Mum, Dad. They're always cleaning up after us. Grandma, Granddad. Auntie, Uncle. Brothers, sisters. Alrighty, everybody. Thank you so much for reading with me today. I hope you liked the story. I'll be back again really soon with another story. Don't you worry about that. Mr. Messy. Cool. Thank you again. Subscribe, click that bell below. Bye for now, but not forever.